Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Earth Day special edition coffee morning for the Earth Institute. So we're really privileged today, I think, to have Michael Ewing join us to speak. So Michael has been playing a leading role in the environmental NGO movement in Ireland over a large number of years. Until recently as coordinator of both the Irish Environmental Network and the Environmental Pillar. And he has agreed he's part of the external advisory board for the Earth Institute and makes really fantastic input to our strategic thinking. And he's kindly agreed to come to speak with us today around an initiative that's really very special. It's a sort of a bottom-up push towards a framework for well-being. Involving community groups and other organisations all around Ireland, which Michael's been strongly involved with. So thanks very much indeed, Michael, for coming to speak with us today.
Thank you, Tasman. Will I commence?
Please do, yeah.
Thank you, Tasman. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to do this. My intention this morning is not to tell you what to do. It's actually to ask you some questions and to look at what those questions might mean for us in Ireland and globally as well, I guess, but mostly in Ireland, to look at how sustainability can be brought about by involving people. So the talk is entitled A Vision for Community Wellbeing versus Bottom-up versus Top-down. And that's kind of a bit of a shorthand, I guess. I'm not sure, I can't see the entirety of my screen, but I'm assuming everybody else can. So my slide screen, that is. I've got pictures of people on the right-hand side taking up part of the screen, but I shall proceed as if everybody can. So the environmental pillar, well, Tasman already mentioned this, and I'll just quickly give you a rundown of what that is, because it's important to the story that follows. The environmental pillar was established in 2009. It had been years and years of the environmental movement knocking on the door of government saying, we want to be a social partner. There were 5 social partners at that time: the farmers, trade unions, the employers, and the community and voluntary sector. And although we were part of the community and voluntary sector, our understanding of the world was very particular. We're coming from the environmental dimension, and the environmental voice in Ireland was very, very weak and not engaged, and the government wasn't really engaged with the environmental concepts at all in any serious way. So the Green Party got into government in 2007, and one of their asks in going into government was that there would be a 5th pillar social partnership, the environmental pillar. So that's what happened in 2009. We were established as a body, and my role was to coordinate that network of 34 national NGOs and to enable them to work together. And it's been working pretty good ever since. I mean, obviously we have our ups and downs like every other group of people, but we have a very strong agreement between ourselves about working consensually, which works pretty well most of the time. But one of the key things that we achieved in this, becoming a social partner, we had the right to nominate people to a whole range of bodies. We had access to ministers, to top civil servants, to all sorts of different things that we couldn't have dreamed of as not being a social partner. So one of the things we were able to do is to nominate individuals to various local government bodies. So we have strategic policy committees which advise local government on areas of policy, and every council, city and county council has strategic policy committees. Some have 4, some have 6 or 7, but the idea of them is to advise the local authority on what they're doing. And so we were able to nominate people onto these bodies as a national organisation. There was also, we were nominating onto the city and county development boards. These no longer exist, but their equivalents we still have the right to nominate onto the boards of the local development companies and a range of other local bodies. So it was a huge step up for the environmental movement. But this is really a very closely cherished right that we had to nominate people onto these bodies. So in 2013, Phil Hogan, this is long before Golfgate, Phil Hogan was the Minister for Local Government, amongst other things, and he wanted to reform local government in Ireland. And one of the things he wanted to look at was the way in which civil society engaged with local government. So he set up a working group on citizen engagement, and he asked Sean Healy from Social Justice Ireland to chair this, and he invited 5 or 6 other people, one of whom was me, representing the environmental pillar. And the reason why we were there was because we had this existing right And they were asking us to give up the right to enable the formation of a new body, which included the environmental sector in it. So we worked for 10 weeks intensively on this. I mean, it was far too short, and it wasn't at all participatory, which it should have been. But it was, we within our own network, we were participatory, but the process itself wasn't the best. So after 10 weeks of 3 hours a day, 3 days a week for the 10 weeks, we came up with a document which the government then accepted pretty much verbatim. And this was then incorporated into the Local Government Reform Act of 2014. So what came out of that working group was this: the establishment of public participation networks. These were to replace the community forum that existed before, and these networks are now existing in every local authority area in the country. So there's 30 odd of them, I can't remember the exact number. The difference between these and the community forums that preceded them was these are flat structures. There is no chairperson, there's no treasurer, there's no secretary. The idea is that they're run by a committee called a secretariat. And on that committee, there's equal representation of the social inclusion sector, the environmental sector, and the community and voluntary sector. Previously in the community forum, it was one organisation, one vote. And that meant you had a total imbalance in terms of the conversations that were being had, because the community and voluntary sector is massive. I mean, everything from kind of Boy Scouts, GAA, everything you can think of. Then you had a social inclusion sector, which was much smaller, and then you had even smaller environmental sector. So under the new participation networks, they all had equal status. And this was really important to us because we were giving up all these rights of nomination. And now we had the rights were held within the PPN structure. And the other thing that we kept was the right to actually say what was an environmental group, because clearly there were groups that said they were environmental and weren't. So those were key things that we got out of that. And we've been working with the PPNs ever since, very effectively, I think. One of the key things that was in this report as well was that every PPN is required to develop a vision for the well-being of their community for this and future generations. This was our way of saying sustainable development is key to these networks, because it was in language people could understand. Well-being was generally understood. People have some kind of an understanding what it means. And we said, look, this is something that every PPN has to do in its early years. And you know, it was absolutely clear this was critical to the success of the PPNs. But we actually didn't know what it meant. We didn't know how it was going to be done either at that point, but it's in the legislation, so it has to be done. So we looked at a whole range of different possible ways of measuring well-being, and there's so many of them out there, thousands of them. And we looked at all these different possible models. And we thought about what community well-being means. I mean, the other ones, there's lots of models for individual well-being per person. What is your well-being? What does it look like? Community well-being less well-defined, but still there were models. And indeed, NESC, the National Economic and Social Council Committee, had done a report back in 2009 on well-being, quite a large report, and it said that it requires that basic needs are met, that people have a sense of purpose, that they feel they're able to achieve their important goals, to participate in society and live the lives they value and have reason to value. So that's a really good sort of broad definition of community well-being. And I think it's a very useful starting point, but it didn't enable us to go much further in terms of how do we develop that. Excuse me. So along with Social Justice Ireland, the environmental pillar, we were kind of like the missionaries for the PPNs and for the Wellbeing Project, because government, although they had this in the legislation, were sitting on their hands pretty much on this all through 2014. So we did a roadshow around the country trying to promote the whole idea of the PPNs and the wellbeing concept. We got very good response, mostly from most places, although obviously we weren't able to say exactly what we meant about the wellbeing idea because it hadn't been refined. And so in 2015, we set up a reference group to look at the whole idea of wellbeing, what it might be and how it might be brought about. And that includes people from all across society, from different government departments, about 20 people in total, including one of the president's team was there as a kind of an observer to see what was going on as well, because he was very interested in this, Michael Lee Higgins' team. So so we talked, we met, we refined, we went over and over it, and eventually we came up with a model of what would look like, what it might look like, this idea of well-being for communities. And we looked at all the obvious things, you know, like the SDGs were just been born in 2015, September 2015. So we looked at them. We looked at the way in which the Carnegie Trust was working on these issues in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We looked at the Canadian model. We looked at other models around the world, but they're all incredibly complicated and they're all top down. This is a key difference. So we decided to, what we wanted to do was do something from the bottom up. And so we had to create a model that works from the bottom up. Just to say, sorry, PPNs, and I missed saying this, PPNs are made up of organizations, not of individual people. So the representatives of organizations make up the PPNs, and there's a lot of them. I'll mention that a bit later. So we went to the PPNs as a whole and said, look, we want to try out some ideas with you, and 4 PPNs volunteered to get involved. One of which was actually very skeptical about the whole project, but nonetheless became involved, which is very helpful because it's good to have a skeptic on board. So the Wicklow, Longford, Roscommon and Cork City PPN, so they represented urban, rural, very rural, and so on populations, to work together on how to develop a toolkit to enable PPNs to develop a vision. So this was a unique project. It was the first in the world, actually. It's never been done anywhere. We spent 6 months in meetings with an external facilitator going through the whole ideas how it should be developed. And we came up with a toolkit, which you can see at that address. But this is what the 6 domains look like when they're kind of shown as a diagram. And you can see there's 6 basic domains, and they cover pretty much everything you can think of in terms of well-being. And there are questions attached to each domain, but the domains are health, work, economy and resources, social and community development, participation, democracy and good governance, values, culture and meaning, and environmental sustainability. So these are the domains that were agreed upon, and then a series of questions under each of those. So for example, under health, physical and mental, how can all members of our community enjoy the best possible physical and mental health? What about people with special needs, older people and carers? Or if you look at the participation, democracy and good governance, what is necessary to ensure that our local authority structures support the well-being of our community for this and future generations? What's necessary to ensure that we have a voice in the decisions that affect us, as all voices are being heard? So these are quite fundamental questions that are being asked of communities and of organizations. So how do you go about then asking these questions and getting the answers? And that was the next thing. That was the toolkit then to deliver on these domains. And this is kind of a rough diagram of how the toolkit works. And if you go to the link that's on the presentation, and I can provide it separately, you'll see the process. But essentially, and I was involved in the pilots and involved in, because I live in Roscommon, so we were one of the pilots there as well. The process begins by obviously telling people about it and getting to understand what the wellbeing idea is and what the concept is, and then bringing them all together in a room, or as many as you can bring in a room, representatives of the member organisations of the PPN, and to set up a series of tables around the room where the gathering groups of 6 with facilitators at each table, and have a map in front of them, literally a map of the county or the city on the table, just an outline map with the main physical features. And they're given labels under the 6 headings to put on the map, stickies on the map, to show where all the different facilities are, resources are in relation to each of the wellbeing dimensions, the wellbeing domains. So they map what they have in the county or the city, and each of them does it on a separate table, and they're doing under the 6 headings. So they have a map, and that takes probably about an hour of intense conversation with people sticking sticks on everywhere, all over the place, getting very excited about it and saying what's there, and remembering what resources they have, where the schools are, where the libraries are, you know, and so on and so on. So, and then they go to another position in the room where they have 6 domains on the wall, and they say, well, what is it that we want to see that isn't there? What are the things we need to have in our community that aren't there already? What are the things we need to develop? So then they go around writing on the wall with a facilitator again at each of the 6 domains, go around in small groups doing that. So it develops an initial list of bullet points. This is then taken away by the facilitator who's running the event, or indeed the resource worker for the PPN. And they collate all the points and they develop a rough draft. And that is then circulated online. And then members of the PPN can respond to that and kind of feed more stuff in, because obviously quite a lot of people wouldn't be there, but they can contact later on. So there's a whole iterative process, a Delphic process, if you like, of developing the vision. And ultimately, the vision is created and it's presented to a plenary of the PPN who vote on it, whether they accept it or not. And then you have the launch of the vision. That's the process of creating it. What happens next is equally interesting, but we'll come to that in a minute. So what is a wellbeing statement? What's it for? Well, the change, I mentioned earlier on that one of the PPNs was very skeptical about the whole process. Well, after the process, they became the main preacher on behalf of the PPNs, because they found this was an enormous advantage to the PPN to do this process. They found that people suddenly were talking to each other about stuff that they hadn't talked about before. And it created a kind of a sense of community in the PPN that hadn't been there before. So it's the glue that holds the network together. It provides a reference point for the representatives who are on these various council committees and other bodies. This is our Bible. This is what we refer back to. If there's a decision to be made, does it tie in with what we've agreed is our vision? If it doesn't, then we say it doesn't, or we bring the vision forward to these various bodies. It's the starting point also for PPN involvement in the development of, in the creation of local economic community plans, county and city development plans, leader programs, social inclusion activation programs, etc. It provides the basis for PPN engagement with consultation calls, national and regional or whatever. It's a live document that develops over time with reviews at least every 2 years, and it's a valuable resource for the county and city council. So, as I said, the process of creation of the Wellbeing Statement brings the members together and they learn things about their community which they probably didn't know before, and they learn that they need to, what they need to do to protect and enhance their community and the community well-being. And it becomes the heart of the PPN, bringing together the wisdom of 3 colleges in one shared, multifaceted, integrated vision for the future. So, for example, in the 2 of the colleges now, they produced a document which was then launched by the council. The council members were brought in, discussed the document with them. Then there's a whole process of evolving, then looking at the, initially this is a very high level document. It looks at in a more of a subjective way than an objective way what's going on, obviously. But then you start looking at the data, the statistics that is available or not available, and what needs to be available, and so on, in order to deliver on this vision. So it's an evolving process. Unfortunately, COVID put pay to a lot of this development, as like so many other things. It came at a very critical time. About half the PPNs have got their visions done, and the other half haven't. So we're waiting and waiting, because it has to be face to face. You can't do this stuff online. It just doesn't work. So, so the next part of what I want to talk about, and this is much shorter than the first part because it's more complicated in many ways, but it's something that I just wanted to pose a question to you. So, for many generations now, GDP has been the way in which we measure the success of our society. GDP growth, yes, great. More GDP growth, even better. And it's a madness in many ways, and it's certainly madness in terms of sustainability, because it requires continuous use and increasing use of natural resources. And it has the unwarranted assumption of equating price with value. And quite clearly, the GDP places great value on expensive armaments, and even things like the drugs trade. You know, the illegal drugs trade affects GDP. All sorts of crimes that affect GDP. The impacts of crime affect GDP. So all these things increase GDP, but is it worth anything? Probably not. The value of caregiving isn't measured, because that's free. So whatever we're measuring, we want to make sure at least it doesn't increase in, you know, we wouldn't expect inequality to get worse. And Stiglitz shown that in America, United States of America, that is, as opposed to the continent, inequality rose throughout the period of 1960 to 2018 phenomenally. And as we can see, the 3 richest men in the US own more wealth than half the rest of the population. So this is the kind of thing that goes on when you just measure GDP. And as an example of how GDP is irrelevant, I mean, the richest country in the world had more than 100,000 COVID-19 related deaths by 2020, June, whereas Vietnam, with only 4% of the same GDP, had none. So what do we do? What do we measure instead? And I think what's happening over the last 10, 15 years is international bodies and governments have been starting to look at how can we measure well-being at a national level that enables us to make decisions that really are going to improve well-being rather than increasing inequality, damaging the environment, and so on and so on. So one of the bodies that's been looking at, our own government is about to go down this road, and indeed one of the other members of the advisory board, the director of NESC, the NESC are actually starting to do work on this on behalf of the government to look at the whole area of how we measure our well-being in Ireland. And this is the Green Party's kind of statement before going into government as what they wanted to have happen. And in fact, I think it's the Green Party's brought about this decision by government to go and look at well-being. So what are the international bodies? Well, the biggest one of is the OECD. It's developed a well-being framework, which has got a large number of goals and measurements, and it's all about metrics, about looking at the statistics and so on at an international or national level. And it's very complex compared to the model I showed you earlier on, which has only 6 domains. Here you have 40 odd different measurements and so on. And if you look at their picture of what Ireland looks like, and it's really very interesting and useful in many ways to look at the how's life in Ireland. This is what it's called. This is 2018, latest available year. But you can see from this very clearly where we're falling down badly and where we're doing well as a country, and that's very useful. And it tells us what needs, where action needs to be taken, but it isn't actually telling you what the actions are to be taken, if you know what I mean. It's really about that. So I guess it's a really useful thing to do, and I think what the government's trying to do is really going to be very valuable, measuring the well-being in Ireland by measuring various metrics. And they're going to use the OECD model as the basis, but they're at the moment going through a whole process, and there's going to be a consultative process around this. And my question, I suppose, is where do these two things meet in the middle? It's the process that's gone on 14,000 member organisations. 14,000 organisations in Ireland are signing up to the wellbeing process that exists already. And it's future focused, and it's a living wellbeing vision driving local change. And then we have the government using OECD complex metrics or some other system similar to it and changing policies in a top-down way. So where will these two processes meet and how will they work together? And that's the question I'm posing to you as the Institute members and people who are joining this event today, because I think it's a question we really need to ask. And I think it's possible that we can bring the two together, but I think that it needs a lot of thinking, a lot of research, and I'm hoping that the work that NESC are doing will actually drive some of this. They're a great outfit. I was on I was part of the committee for 10 years at NESC. So I do know how they work, and I think they have a very good team in there. But it is a complicated question, and we don't want to disenfranchise or minimise the power of this existing structure that's working on wellbeing. So I'm going to leave it there. I don't know whether I've overstepped my time or not, but Gura Maigath, and thank you. So I'm happy to take questions or discuss whatever anybody wants to talk about.
Thanks very much indeed, Michael. Yeah, that was fantastic. Really,
I'm going to bring you back to the slide with the 6 domains on it, just so it's on the screen.
Sounds good. Yeah. There we go. Yeah, brilliant. So, does anyone have any answers to the question, or any other questions or comments that they'd like to pose? I think that's always the way initially. It is a fascinating. Nessa, would you like to ask?
Sorry, I'm going to have to go in literally 2 minutes, but thank you, Michael. That was really very interesting. And I do a lot of work in this area, and I'm not really familiar with the work that you've done on this. So thanks for sharing it. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that it's a major challenge, what you are hoping to do to merge the wonderful work that you've done, bottom-up work that's been done, but to try and merge that with existing comparative work is going to be very challenging. But I'd be very happy to have a chat with you about it. But as I have to go now, maybe I can just get your email from Will or Taz, and maybe make a date to do that. I can also send you. I've been doing some work on how do you define sustainable communities, which includes a lot of these dimensions that you're talking about. Communities that are sustainable socially, as well as environmentally and economically. And so they would touch on some of these important dimensions that you mentioned. So I can send you a draft of a paper that I've
well, thank you, Nessa. That'd be very helpful. And I might pass it on
yeah,
to other people then as well. Thank you.
And also on behalf of myself and other colleagues, just to congratulate you for your fantastic work in this area. And it's just so nice to see that you have made so much progress in many ways. And yeah, thank you very much. And apologies for having to leave.
Thank you, Nessa. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Nessa. Yeah, there's also a comment in the chat from Tamara Hochstrasser, also deeply impressed with the work and also unable to stay much longer for discussion, but flagging the kind of the bottom-up initiatives should be taken into consideration as part of the national strategic planning. I guess that kind of gives prominence to the top-down kind of approach, that way of phrasing it. But Jenny's got a hand up. Would you like to?
Great, thank you. I don't know if you can see me or hear me, and I'm apologies.
Jenny, yes.
Okay, great. I'm on my phone because my house doesn't have any power at the moment, which is actually really refreshing to not have any electricity. Yeah. So it's really lovely to meet you. I know this is a coffee morning, so if we were in person, we could sit around and have a more casual chat, which I do miss. Just to introduce myself to you, so I'm a researcher here at UCD. I have a specialism in wellbeing and engagement. We're currently doing a European-wide project on young people's wellbeing, children's wellbeing, lots of data on wellbeing. And to kind of address the question that you'd like us to consider, I was thinking about how we're currently doing it in our own work, because we're looking a lot at individual well-being and all of the models that you mentioned, that you inferred to, we'd be considering those models in our work. But then does something become qualitatively different when you raise it up at the level of the community, qualitatively different to individual well-being? And I think that's such a great question and a great project and a great aspiration to have. But then how do you look at that across different countries, especially when we already have these kinds of well-established indicators across Europe of measuring well-being? And I think the question of how do they come together is, for me, a question about time, because I see the field of well-being moving relatively stably towards a more coherent understanding across different cultures and communities about things that are important. And if we take the diversity agenda, for example, that's something that's really become at the forefront of a lot of thinking internationally in many cultures, but not all, unfortunately. So I think, that there's an element of kind of lobbying, communications, discussions that need to be held to really bring these organic models of well-being, these community-based models, to the forefront of what we might be looking at in international comparative work, where, for example, the GDP is not going to represent well-being, however it's included in these OECD models. So, how can we kind of bridge that gap is really, really interesting, and just to really acknowledge the complexity there. And thank you very much for an interesting talk.
Thank you, Jenny. And sorry, damn, excuse me now, it's my landline. Would you believe I have a landline? I'm very old-fashioned. I just turned it off. The issues you raised in terms of matching, and obviously cross-cultural between countries, and even on these islands, there are differences, and even within the islands, within this country as well, and even on this one island, we have quite strong cultural differences that need to be taken into account as well. And that, indeed, the work of Carnegie Trust in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales and England, looking at different processes have emerged in each of these places. They're all top down, but they are all kind of looking at it in different ways. So it is a very interesting area. And I mean, we came into it very much as ignoramuses into this whole process to start with, and kind of learned a lot on the way through. So I think probably your work and that of the previous speaker would be very interesting to NESC, who are doing this research at the moment on how to deliver on the intention of the Programme for Government on Wellbeing. I think that you would have things to say to them which they might find very useful. So maybe you should approach NESC and let them know you exist if they don't know already. And maybe obviously one of their director is actually part of the advisory body for this institute. So I imagine that Tasman could pass on that information.
Thanks. That's interesting. I'll be considering it. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny.
Sure.
Hello. Hello. This is Sean here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Sean.
Yeah,
how are you, Sean?
yeah.
A neighbour of
Great.
mine.
Good morning, Michael. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
I think the questions being raised are really rich and challenging. I'm on the NESC working group. So there's a working group with NESC looking at this whole well-being framework and how to report to government, which is going to be done in a very challenging time. I think they're NESC are hoping to report to government at the end of June, beginning of July kind of thing. I know the whole question about what they call consultation is very much to the minds of the people on the working group, but it's not at all clear how that's going to happen. And what seems to me to be clear is that the OECD framework is extremely attractive to senior civil servants and those working on, if you like, policy implementation. What's not at all clear, the way it's positioned at the moment is that this type of framework will help with policy implementation across the various silos of public service, and then monitoring, and then obviously review of policy. But what's not at all clear to me is what kind of vision there is for well-being and how it might drive policy. And I think this is where Michael's input is really, really important. The other kind of blind spots that I see in the NESC process are all of the other areas that we associate with well-being indirectly, like sport and heritage and culture and music and so on, the things that are really important to living that we've discovered just recently, probably, well, not discovered, but certainly they're much more evident because of COVID. I just want to also mention, so you mentioned there, NESC, I think NESC would very much welcome anyone's input. They're extraordinarily open. So please do, I would encourage anybody who's working in the area of well-being to contact them and to give an input. It's not too late. They are very open to bilateral conversations and so on. The other thing I just want to mention, I'm involved with the Wellbeing Economics Alliance. So there's this international group that's looking at well-being, and they link into a whole range of, if you like, groups working or interested in well-being, things like the circular economy, the donut economy, you know, community health and well-being groups, the collaboration for change in the north. There's a whole range of different types of groups coming together, looking at, I suppose, putting the economy in its place. You know, I'd be very interested from Michael's point of view is to see how do they fit in. I'm involved in the PPN in Leitrim, and Leitrim is probably not one of the best counties in the country in terms of exactly how the PPN is working. It's there, it's gathering, but I would question the how would I call it, the influence that it really has on policy in a county like Leitrim. But I'd be very interested in Michael's comments on how all of those other organizations can link into this process of community well-being and the bottoms-up approach as well.
Sean, which organizations are you referring to there, Sean? Sorry.
It's we all. So this is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance.
Okay, yeah. But you just said how these other bodies can feed into the.
No, when I say these other bodies are like the group, the Donors Economy Group. There's a
okay. Feeding into the, well, obviously at a local level they don't particularly feed. I'm not quite understanding your question. I don't think, Sean. Sorry.
So my question is like I think what's really worked so far through the PPNs is this approach of bringing people together through. I don't know how you describe them. Like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance would be different to the Donor Economy, to the all these, not based, if you like, a geographical entity, whereas the PPNs are based on a county in general, working in with local authority. And I totally admire that. I think it's a great approach. But these are other groups that are kind of ad hoc. The Cork Environmental Forum have done great things in terms of stimulating debate and discussion and so on. And all these people would have different ideas, as I think in your own experience with the environmental network and the pillar and so on, that it gathers together a whole diverse range of different organizations who would all, I think, have a say in defining what community well-being is.
Yeah, I just say that the experience in each location is different. And you're absolutely right that in Leitrim, the PPN isn't in great shape, but in other counties it's in top shape. And the influence on local decision making has been quite good. So it is a developing process. I think clearly when we were developing this concept, and I say we, it was actually all the PPNs together developing this idea and this process. It was done with the background of information from all these other processes have gone elsewhere, including the SDGs, the OECD, etc., etc. We looked at all of those and said, well, how can we do this at a very much at a local level, bring it down to very sort of easily manageable, easily understood concepts, rather than trying to expand it too much, which is why that model that's on the screen now ended up being the model, because it was simpler rather than having 40 odd dimensions or whatever else, which might be more accurate in terms of if you want to make decisions at a national level, at a local level, this worked better. I don't think I'm answering your question at all, Sean, but I'm not sure I still quite understood it. But anyway, hopefully, but I mean, essentially the PPNs are an experiment in the sense in themselves, which has been going on since the end of 2014. They're evolving, their process is evolving. I mean, it's just produced a handbook on the PPNs, produced by the members. I would just say, you mentioned, Sean, there about this consultation process. When we created the PPNs, and I say we, it was the government in the end, but it was the working group that I was part of, the word participation was definitely a key word in that. And the concept of consultation is so passive and so not what we should be doing. It's all about participation, and that's what this process of developing this wellbeing concept for the government needs to be participatory. Having a consultation in the traditional sense is really a bad place to start.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that as well, that kind of process of combining bottom up with top down. My sense is that the SDGs are the success that they are because they had a much more participatory process for their development than their predecessors had, you know, and that has got to be the key to success, to get people's buy-in and involvement and sense of ownership of the plan, which is the way that, as you described it.
You did right, Tasman. I mean, the SDGs, 4 or 5 years of consultation, I mean, participation, sorry, 4 or 5 years of our participatory process globally. I mean, I was involved in a couple of them, and they were absolutely fascinating because you're talking to people from all different parts of the world about participation, for example, and finding out, learning from other people about the way they do it so much better or the way they do it so much worse, and so on. So it's really that kind of a process is what we need here in terms of this, whether the government will actually go down that road or not, because clearly there's always a struggle, I mean, between getting things done before the government collapses and sort of, you know, that kind of urgency that's in there, and then getting things done right and well, as you know, there's that bit of a dynamic.
Absolutely, so that they actually have a durable long-term effect because people have actually bought into them. Yeah. It's a really tricky balance. Does anybody else have any additional questions to ask? I had one more, which is slightly tangential. You mentioned GDP as the big measure. What are your feelings about the Gross National Happiness Index, and as it was developed in Bhutan, I think, originally? And I think that they don't really publish GDP figures. They publish gross national happiness figures each year and work towards improving that
That's one of the ones we looked at actually when we were developing this concept. And I mean, again, if you look even at our nearest neighbour, Wales, they have a wonderful setup there in a sense, because they have the ombudsman for future generations. They have an external process of measuring with the so I'm just trying to think of the name of they basically have a process in which all the ministers, all the different government departments are basically they're told to do sustainable development, and there's somebody measuring whether they're doing it or not. So that's kind of the way they're doing it there, and it's absolutely brilliant. And they have effectively seven domains of their process they're measuring against. A lot of indicators related to them, but 7 domains. So there's all these different potential models, and I think if we stick very closely to the OECD one, it's going to be not necessarily what we need. It has its advantages. It has its, as I think it was Jenny who mentioned, it's comparable internationally, so that's useful. But it does, at the same time, we could do both. We could have 2 sets of, we could have that, and we can have another one which says this is what this is more important to us, but for comparative purposes. And the reason why we didn't go with the SDGs, and we've mapped the SDGs against these 6 domains as well, by the way. There's 17 of them. You know, it's just too much for most people to take on board. You know, it's really complicated for most people. I mean, obviously you can do it graphically, like this badge here, you know, which is kind of 17 SDGs. Most people think it's to do with kind of, I don't know, equal opportunities, sort of marriage being open to everybody and all that kind of stuff. But actually, it's the SDGs, you know, but it's a complex idea, the SDGs, and they are about governance rather than about at a very low level. They're really about government decision making rather than you know, the way governments behave. But you can look at Germany, you can look at New Zealand, you can look at Iceland. All these different countries have different models of doing it with varying degrees of success. I think for ourselves, probably the one to look at most is the Welsh one, because I think it's probably the most culturally similar to our own, and the size of the country is similar, and so on. But I mean, sure, we could be well able to produce our own model, but I think, and going back to NESC actually, Sean, and it was just while you were talking there, reminded me, I was on the council of NESC for nearly 10 years, and on a regular basis, myself and Sean Healy used to raise the issue of why can't we have a discussion about a vision for the country? And every time we did this, it was kind of pushed back on by the officials, because the chair of the council is actually the Secretary General to the government. So, you know, they didn't really want to do this. So, but that's exactly what's needed.
Sorry, can I just come in again?
Please, yeah.
Just very briefly. You're talking about vision. I don't know if many people watched Michael D's interview with Ryan Tubridy on the Late Late Show, but there was a phenomenally positive response by people watching it, you know, saying how lucky we are to have such a president and so on. But I think in the middle of it, he expressed a kind of a vision for the country, and he has this unique way of expressing visionary things, but grounded in very, very sound principles. And somehow I think that when we're looking at this, for me, what's missing from the NESC model and all the other models, there are lots of models out there, is the vision. Where are we going? What are really the values? You know, where are we putting our stakes in the ground? And it takes someone like Michael D to express that, I think. And maybe that's what we should be looking for. I've used this concept of a noble leader. We need a noble leader rather than political leaders who are going to disappear.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we can always come back to the kind of the combination of top down and bottom up. There's such an important interplay there, I think. But, I think so. We're kind of getting to the end of the time that we should take. We said we would overrun a bit, but we shouldn't overrun by too much. I'd be really happy to carry on this conversation for a lot longer. It's really fascinating to me. Does anybody else have one last quick question before we wrap things up? Okay, then, well, I hope we will get a chance to carry on the conversation further along the line, especially in an informal setting. As Jenny said, it's such a different game, and as Michael said, you know, some things really do need that face-to-face contact. The kinds of initiatives you're describing. So I do look forward to the day that we can talk about this more informally. And I hope we'll get that opportunity sooner rather than later. And really, thank you very much again, Michael, for a fantastic presentation and a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks yourself for having me. Enjoyed it.